technology to drive the vaccine uptake. And that panel will be moderated by Rebecca Distler. And she's a public health expert currently working as a global health programs lead, ID 2020, a growing public-private partnership in maximizing the design, funding, and implementation of digital ID solutions and technologies. She has worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Grand Challenges Initiative, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the WHO Regional Office in Fiji. She has a lot of accomplishments, a lot under her belt, which makes her the absolute perfect person to moderate this particular panel. So we welcome Rebecca Distler.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm just giving my panelists a moment.
No problem. Well, welcome. Can you hear us? Okay, I'm not too certain if she can hear us, but we just came from a panel discussion where we spoke about herd immunity, and we were speaking about the importance of managing that delicate line between getting your population vaccinated, but also, you know, being cognizant that there is fear and that there are persons who will want to resist. As a doctor in the space, we've seen the memes, right? We've seen social media, Facebook. We've seen how misinformation travels extremely fast. How important, how difficult is it for the healthcare, government, even private sectors to get ahead or to stay toe on toe with misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. I think with the virality of media, misinformation, disinformation is now really a pandemic. And, you know, we say there's an information bankruptcy because it's very difficult to identify the sort of critical mass of information beyond the noise. And so governments, any large institutions have a responsibility to ensure that the correct information is diffused to the masses. Large companies like Facebook and YouTube, which we'll be hearing from later today, will share sort of their role in ensuring that the health literacy is available at scale.
Absolutely. Kirk, over to you. We heard Minister Bartlett come in and speak about vaccinating and preparing not only the population for itself but to receive tourists. Now, last year we had the conference, Tourism, Health and Wellness, and the theme was reset, reimagine, the word that you used, and restore, not just depending on tourists to come in and just love the sea and the sand, but creating ecosystems of health and wellness. What are some of the opportunities you see there in terms of expanding investments in terms of tourism, wellness, and health, and that ecosystem?
So I think while there's a health and wellness opportunity, I don't think the full focus only has to be on that in terms of managing against the pandemic. What we've seen a lot of countries starting to focus on is the idea of long-term stays, right? I think beyond people being able to either get treated or have some form of, wellness facility at their disposal, there's still other activities that folks want to participate in. The mindset that has to shift, though, is if I'm spending, or if someone is coming to a country for 30 days or 60 days or something of that nature, you have people coming to Caribbean territories and they would have landed last June and they're not planning to leave until this June, right? They're still tourists.
Correct.
But how do you start to service someone who is in a territory for elongated periods, wherein the way we used to design tourism was on the basis of someone is coming for a week, they're coming for 2 weeks, they're going to need to see the dolphins, they're going to need to go up to the mountains, they're rushing over to this place to windsurf or something of that nature. The activities totally change, and the services that the private sector not only can provide, but generally needs to provide in order for these people to feel comfortable also shifts. So that's where I think the opportunities really lie, and that people, and organizations can focus on. What is it that someone who is not familiar, coming from overseas, staying for long, really needs, and how can you provide it?
Fantastic answer. Okay, so I had thrown to Rebecca Distler for the panel discussion. So we're going to see if she can hear us and if that panel discussion is ready and up and running, talking about vaccine uptake, harnessing the power of policy and technology to drive vaccine uptake. So let us see if they are ready.
Hi, can you hear us?
Perfectly. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome. I'm not sure if you heard the introduction, but we totally introduced you. Thank you for your time. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We're delighted to be here to be talking about harnessing the power of policy and technology to drive vaccine uptake. Before I introduce our panelists, just a quick note of context. So today, over 150 million people worldwide have already received one dose of COVID-19 vaccine, which is a remarkable number, especially when we consider that these vaccines were brought to market within 12 months. But it also doesn't tell the full story. In the United States, where I'm dialing in from, over 50 million people have received their first dose. By contrast, Ghana received its first shipment of doses last week and is only the second country outside of India to receive COVID-19 vaccines and shipped through the COVAX facility. I think we all know and agree that central to an inclusive recovery from this pandemic is the need for large-scale, equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. That distribution will be the largest procurement and supply operation in human history. Countries are developing national vaccination plans and addressing challenges in cold chain and stockpiling supplies to ensure that health workers can start vaccinating priority groups as soon as possible. And as these rollouts progress, our task ahead will not just be about how we get vaccines into countries, but also into communities and ultimately into arms. And from vaccine delivery to vaccine hesitancy, we know that there are many barriers to vaccine uptake, whether, when, and how individuals will be able to access and actually receive their vaccines. So today's discussion will explore these barriers with a focus on emerging markets. We'll explore how we can harness technology to create more efficient and inclusive vaccination processes, and where policy can help create enabling environments that ensure everyone who wants and need a vaccine can get one. These are urgently important topics, and I couldn't dream of a better group of experts to share their perspectives than the ones joining us today. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Talia Varley, who is a practicing physician and a practicing clinician and current physician lead of advisory services at Cleveland Clinic Canada's Medical Director Program, which provides non-healthcare organizations with a chief medical director backed by the Cleveland Clinic. We're joined by Dr. Kampo, who is an expert in development aid and humanitarian assistance, and has worked as a physician surgeon in hospitals and clinics across Africa and Asia. Dr. Kampo currently serves as director of health programs at UNICEF and has spent the last 14 years in various senior leadership positions across international NGOs and UN agencies. We have Dr. Junaid Nabi, a physician, public health researcher, and medical journalist. His research examines the origins of healthcare disparities and understanding how strategy can be used to transform care delivery and promote health equity. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Kiran Mohammed, the co-founder of MEDL, a health tech social enterprise developing an end-to-end prescription platform. MEDL launched in the Caribbean, but has plans to expand across the emerging markets and was recently one of 5 solutions funded by the Inter-American Development Bank Lab COVID-19 Challenge. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I should share that as we kick off this conversation, please utilize the Q&A function so that we can also share your questions with this panel. So to kick us off, I think it's important that we ground us in the problem itself. And so my open question to the panelists are, from your work and your perspectives, what are the main barriers to vaccine uptake? And Dr. Kampo, I'd love to turn it over to you to kick us off on this conversation.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me this morning. I think the main barrier, of vaccine uptakes is, first of all, the organizations making sure that the vaccines is basically in country and is basically in place. But we also have vaccine hesitancies, which is basically one of the biggest issues which we are facing. I think with technology, social media is playing a bigger role now in communities, and I think people are getting a lot of information from their social media platforms, and sometimes it's good information, sometimes it's bad information. So it's and that is something which we really need to tackle at one point of time. I think from a UNICEF perspective, we are dealing in terms of immunization on vaccine hesitancies, not just, for COVID-19. We have been dealing with that also in the normal routine immunization program. One of the biggest, success story, if I can mention it, where we are addressing basically vaccine hesitancy, is in the polio eradication program, where we have basically an army of community health workers. It's really depending on from countries to countries how we are tackling those vaccine hesitancy. But it also involves really listening to the communities, what is their priorities. I mean, there are a number of things which needs to be done to basically address vaccine hesitancy. But this is definitely one of the main issues, when it comes to uptake. And then we have the equity issues, really making sure, that vaccines are actually equitably distributed within the countries. If it's not, it drives another aspect in terms of rejecting a program or not being participating into another program because people do not believe in the government or in their systems in itself, and all those different elements are feeding into each other's, and creating issues in terms of vaccine uptakes. Let me stop here and maybe some of my panel members can add to it.
Excellent. Dr. Nabi, would you like to share your perspective?
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me. I completely agree with Dr. Kampo's points on all of these elements. To me, there are various levels of hesitancy, and some are at the individual level and some are at the systems level. He's already described the most important ones, but I think what I can add to that is the element of trust. A lot of the patient populations, not just in the West, but in a lot of countries in the global South, are hesitant with regard to the vaccine because historically they have not been, they have not received that kind of care from their health systems. So if you look at in the US, recent Gallup polls show that there is a considerable amount of population that is still hesitant with regard to the COVID vaccine. And that goes back to a lot of unethical experiments that were carried on different marginalized populations in the US, from Tuskegee's study to some others. And in the global South, it's the same as as Dr. Kampo mentioned. The governments have not always taken care of the populations, and that often leads to that deficit of trust. So that is an element that we must address and work towards. I think it's going to be a challenge, as he's described already, with regard to disinformation that is going around, especially with the social media. Health systems and health ministries have to invest a lot of resources in developing and fostering that trust. Without that, it's not going to be possible to address these. It's not just a matter of supply and demand, which is a very practical issue, but it's also an issue of how much the patient populations really believe in the health systems and the leaders in the health system. So I think that is an element that would require a lot of work.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Varley, perhaps I turn it over to you for your perspectives. And I know that you have worked certainly across Canada and the US, and would encourage you to share your experiences and lessons learned around vaccine hesitancy there as well.
Absolutely, and I agree with all the points made. Especially access. When people ask us what are the two biggest barriers to reaching herd immunity, it's certainly access and uptake. And on the access side, there are a lot of elements there in that, there's the procurement piece, there's the, fulfillment of those sort of APAs that might have been established, many, many months ago. But even in terms of the complexity of the supply chain and the distribution, the fragility of some of these vaccine doses in terms of, the timeline to use them, sort of once they're being activated, once they sort of leave that manufacturing facility. All of this starts to sort of bottleneck the amount of doses that, might be developed or manufactured, but how they actually reach people within the community. Further, I think we've had great comments on the concept of trust and, considering issues around misinformation. I think a big theme we've seen is just acknowledgement of the complexity of the information out there right now. So even if we think about a topic like vaccines and we take away any of the, the myths and misinformation, there's actually a lot of debate and a lot of variability in terms of messaging that might be coming from different public health agencies in different, provinces, states, and countries. So I think a good example of that would be something like AstraZeneca. And some countries might say that despite it being approved for broad use, perhaps they might recommend that it's only used in those who are under 65. Other countries might have sort of broader use, and sort of if you're an elderly member of the community, you might be able to use it as well. And so I think all of this, features very much into not necessarily only misinformation, but just given the complexity, a lot of confusion. So people don't always sort of know what they don't know. And that might be a really significant barrier towards people getting the vaccine and getting it in a timely fashion where they feel like they have all the data points that they need to be able to make an informed decision.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those comments. Kiran, I turn it over to you to share your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has put it really well. And I would just sort of, to summarize it, one, we're just not spending enough money, as the world is not spending enough money on the vaccine. Like on average, developing countries have combined spent less than 1% of their national budgets, forget 1% of GDP, on the vaccine. That to me is just crazy, right? So yes, of course, there's COVAX. Yes, of course, the developed countries are spending, but also developing countries do need to step up budgetary support. There's no question, because the ROI is huge. A lot of it is actually less about money than people think. So that's the first side of it. The second, and plow that money directly into expanding capacity. As I know is something that Dr. Kampo has been advocating for, expanding capacity in emerging markets. So that's the first one. Of course, the second one, as everyone else has put very well, is in terms of trust and coordination. I think Talia mentioned coordination of messaging, but also I'd like to mention coordination of regulation, right? Because in developing countries, most of them, nobody has the kind of resources as the FDA. Nobody has the kind of resources as the UK's regulatory agency. I mean, the developing countries should be getting together and simply stating that, okay, if the FDA has approved it, or the UK has approved it, or maybe some combination of the two, then it gets automatically approved. Because that right now, the fact is it's having to go through, I actually read something that Adar Poonawala, who is the CEO of Serum Institute of India, he said he has 70 million vaccines sitting, waiting, that expire at the end of April. And the only reason, they're manufactured, they're sitting there. These are AstraZeneca. The only reasons that they haven't been shipped out is because in each of these individual developing countries, it has to go through their own regulatory approval, which to my mind is crazy.
Thank you for those comments. So, to summarize, I think what we've seen, even in just this few minutes of discussion, is truly the complexity of not just vaccine distribution, but of access, complexity of supply and demand, complexity of coordination and financing. Certainly a geopolitical element in here as well on vaccine procurement and distribution. And then confusion on messaging and trust in systems. I believe Dr. Nabi, I want to pick up on something that you shared in thinking about this at the individual level versus the systems level. And I would, before we sort of move into the next part of our conversation around technology, I'm curious, I want to open up another question to the panel on, as we think about this myriad of challenges at the systems level and at the individual level, what are other successful programs that we can look to, other successful programs that have improved uptake in vaccination or improved uptake in healthy behaviors that may have important lessons learned for COVID-19 vaccines? So I turn it back over to the panel for anyone who wants to pick up that question.
Rebecca, if I may start, I think, we have programs available. I mentioned one of them, which is the polio eradication program, which addresses vaccine hesitance, in a very constructive manner. But it involves serious investment in human resources, because vaccine hesitancies, you need to listen to the community, you need to set up programs, and sometimes it's just going beyond just the actual program which you're putting in place. So, for example, for polio eradication, we have been doing polio eradication in many countries for the last 15, 20, 25 years, and communities are fed up, for people to come with a program, just with for one particular disease. So you need to integrate it, into a bigger package, looking at what are the concerns. And it goes back again to the point where further Dr. Nabi has said, in terms of building trust with the community. If your health systems are weak, and then you come with a very comprehensive program just for one particular disease, it always raises suspicions within the community. Why for that we're making a big fuss out of it, and why for the other priorities, which are our priorities, nobody really cares. And I think there needs to be a comprehensive response to that. But I would like to also highlight, I think we shouldn't be looking yes, there have been issues with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines assistance right now. But let's not forget, this is a pandemic. I think in many instances, we have been dealing with epidemics, which is a small group of countries where the situation raised. Now it's everywhere, and producing a vaccine is not that simple. It's not that easy. And so I think we should be also very clear, even in the best case scenarios with the technology at hand today, we will not be able in 2021, to vaccinate every single person on this planet, because the production capacity of actually of having those vaccines in place, for the entire population is not really there. So what we can do is just basically looking at how far have you gone this year, and how will we make it, how will we be probably better prepared for the next pandemic, because there are future pandemic will be coming, and making sure that we have a better capacities in terms of manufacturing, those vaccines, in particular if it's in new versions. And the other element, and I don't want to monopolize the discussion here, is the issue with variants, which we have as well. When you have variants coming up, then it becomes, difficult for manufacturers, to invest, because this vaccine might not be necessarily as effective against this particular variant, and it costs money to do research and development, those vaccines. We have seen that at the beginning of 2020, when the pandemic started, basically, we had a lot of manufacturers or a lot of companies who were involved in trying to get basically a vaccine out, and then slowly they have been dropping off because, it does cost money to do this research. It does not cost money to basically to multiply them. So I think we're in an unusual situation here where, yes, inequity has been seen around the globe, but we should also, applaud for the global community of coming together and trying to tackle these issues as best as they can. And yes, there have been issues, and yes, we can complain about a lot of things, but not everything has been bad. I would say, I think a lot of progress has been made. A lot of has been relied on what we knew from other successful programs, as you have mentioned, Rebecca.
Excellent. And Dr. Nabi and Dr. Varley, I see you nodding along. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that before we transition into the next part of our conversation?
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kampo for that reality check. It's always good to reflect on how the situation has unfolded, because we can get caught up in the news cycle. I think the polio vaccination has obviously been a very, very important example of a success story. For example, in India, which is a country with more than 1 billion people, it has been successfully implemented. And that goes back to Kiran's point earlier about coordination. That's very important. It's not just, I'd like to stress this again and again, because this is very important. It's not just about the supply and demand. It's not just about manufacturing, because those are logistical challenges that we have to address, but there are greater forces at play that we have to look at as well. I wasn't aware of the news Kiran was mentioning with regard to Serum Institute, which it's terrible news. And what we are looking at is a wastage of such an important resource. People are in such need for this vaccine, and a lot of it is being wasted because of lack of coordination. And so I would like to hear more later on, if we have time, Kiran's thoughts on how we can better coordinate such things, because it is important for different countries, not just to focus on manufacturing element, but also on coordination of approval and regulatory processes, so that they can work through the pandemic together. We have known this for a while now, and I think again and again, we have to focus on the fact that the virus does not respect national borders. The virus does not care about social status. The virus does not care about your professional, social, or economic background. We've seen world leaders. We have seen, in fact, we've seen a lot of world leaders, given the kind of leadership a lot of them have exhibited, falling to the virus. So I think focusing on that element and keeping and staying grounded in reality, as Dr. Kampo has been stressing on from the beginning, that's very important. But the polio vaccination program in India and in a lot of countries has been a success story because how they focused on different elements of the implementation strategy. They didn't just focus on the manufacturing and the supply issues, which are issues that we have to deal with, and we might need more innovation given how much the economies have suffered from COVID. But we do have to focus on information campaigns. We have to focus on marketing. We have to focus on equitable distribution of vaccines. We have to focus on identifying vulnerable populations and getting the vaccine to them as soon as possible. And lastly, we also have to focus on investing in the system itself. We can't just be reacting every single time there is a pandemic. This is not even surprising for someone who's paying attention to global health systems. The pandemic just reveals all the cracks that so many global health experts have been trying to highlight for so long. And this is not going to be the last one. A pandemic is always an issue of when, not if. So we have to prepare for this, and the more prepared we are, the more investments we make, both in the infrastructure and human capacity. I think that would be the way to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those remarks. I want to pick up on something that you just shared in the end around the investments that need to be made in community engagement, in coordination, equitable distribution, and on the systems themselves. And something that is central, I think, to all of this, but also to the conversation here today, is the role of technology. And technology can mean so many different things, from supply chain management to coordination to scheduling of doses to digital health records, vaccine certificates. And what I would love to do is to have that conversation around where technology can play a role in encouraging vaccine uptake, and thinking about technology at, again, communications, behavior change messages, straight through the investments we need to make in digital infrastructure. And as we have this conversation, I would encourage our panelists to also share not just where it can play a role in encouraging uptake, but also where we risk perpetuating that hesitancy and those barriers. So perhaps, Kiran, I will turn it over to you first for your remarks.
Sure, of course. So, I mean, MEDL, the company that we started, myself and my co-founder, was started really around the issue of medication compliance, which many people will be very familiar with, sort of solving the problem that 1 in 2 prescriptions globally are never taken. So I think there's definitely a lot of parallels now to sort of vaccine uptake. That we are already seeing, having focused on that problem. So the way we try to use technology, and I'm so glad that you also mentioned about the ways that technology can be challenging, right? Particularly in developing countries, which is where we're looking at making the impact. It's so critical, one, that technology be directly connected to human intervention. So, for example, in our case, we enable doctors to electronically prescribe to patients. Yes, they can order and manage their medication through their app, but the core thing is also connecting them to the pharmacist to counsel them with their medication on an ongoing basis and educate them about the costs and the benefits, being transparent. So that's where, because there's a lot of distrust of technology as well, too, in emerging markets, as many of you will be familiar with. So the question is, okay, well, how can we use technology actually to build that kind of trust? And the key thing there is transparency. Now, transparency, obviously, as Talia mentioned again earlier, transparency is a bit difficult when you've got a dozen different messages coming out about even the efficacy of one particular vaccine, and everyone saying there's not enough data. But there, like for example, Junaid spoke a bit about the successes of the polio vaccine as well, and patients overall, the patients respond much better when you're very, very clear about, okay, what are the risks involved, and then what are the benefits. We can't, I think that there have been voices calling for this, sort of silence the anti-vaxxers, but I think that if we don't approach it from a position of empathy and build that into technology, then definitely it won't work at all. Actually, Rebecca, there's a really interesting example in Taiwan that I saw that was very cool about sort of tackling that they're starting to use to tackle vaccine hesitancy there. And they use social media in an interesting way. So Taiwan's Ministry of Technology hired people who have cute dogs and cats, right? And literally, their only job is whenever sort of they see a post going viral about, say, I don't know, vaccine conspiracies or something like this, they have their army of people, and their job is to create cute cat memes and dog memes, kind of like making fun of it. And what that does, it actually engages a lot with how people are thinking, as opposed to sort of a formal press release from a government agency, which people don't feel connected to. They're already primed to distrust. So yeah.
No, thank you for sharing a very interesting example of the importance of behavior change communications and empathetic design in certainly in digital communications, but also within technology itself. Dr. Varley, I would love to bring you up into this conversation. I know that you are a practicing physician, that you are working across both the United States and in Canada. And I'm curious the role that technology plays in how you interact with patients and how you encourage vaccine uptake amongst the communities that you work with. So would love to hear your perspectives on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that as much as we've been talking about virtual care for what sounds or feels at least like decades, we haven't necessarily seen the strongest uptake in the fastest turnaround. But in a bit of a silver lining, I think COVID and the pandemic has really created a true inflection point for virtual care, and I think forced a lot of clinicians to accelerate the speed at which they would have previously adopted more of those virtual touch points. It does create some barriers for people when it comes to socioeconomic status and those who might not have sort of ready access to, internet connection, devices, et cetera. But by and large, it's been a way to more quickly and more agilely be able to connect with patients for really rapid touch points, because the barriers to entry around, driving 30 minutes to potentially see a clinician who doesn't live close to where you are, sitting in the waiting room versus if you're working from home or if you're out in the community, you wait for a call, you're sort of in a digital waiting room. It doesn't really impact your day as much. So I think that we're really primed to be able to get this messaging out. Part of the challenges that we're seeing is just a bit of that patchwork model within the healthcare system rearing its head right now. So when we think about things like signing up for vaccine appointments, as we start to roll out our programs further and further, all of a sudden, one area or one local health network is going to be operating very differently from another one. And so you even get questions from patients on, well, my uncle or my friend was able to do this and access this healthcare system. And perhaps one hospital or one healthcare system has really launched a digital robust model to be able to engage patients in education, to be able to engage them in really seamless booking of different vaccine appointments when, again, their time is up and their priority segment is welcome to book. But it's actually creating, some resistance in terms of feeling like, again, that messaging is lost, that sense of like cohesiveness in terms of, equality and fairness and access. So I think it's something that we all battle with, and particularly within the medical community, physicians as well aren't necessarily all getting the consistent messaging, and so it's a bit difficult to help patients navigate when there's a bit of that same patchwork across the healthcare system itself. Within the corporate environment, important to note that just like within healthcare provider systems, they are in some ways already dealing with, digital patient data when you think about health screenings and temperature screenings and documenting those things. And so as that might be a step, our foot in the door, rather, as we start to think about vaccination, perhaps that opens, a forum for employers to take more of a role in terms of vaccine education, monitoring of uptake within your organization, and really helping to amplify the messages of public health through many, many different sort of speaking mechanisms.
Thank you so much for those comments. Dr. Nabi or Dr. Kampo, anything that you would like to add on this topic?
Well, yes, I think, technology has been central. I mean, just creating some of those vaccines is new technology. So I think it is part of that as well. I think from a UNICEF perspective, I think in terms of battling, the vaccine hesitancies, I think we're very clear. We run some few polls, and we're using we have something that we call in UNICEF U report, which is basically present in 17 countries, where we're running polls with the communities, and we are asking them, do they believe in the vaccines and why they don't believe and where they get their information from, And it's very surprising, that you have, close to 40% of those who have been polled, and it's quite a large number, do not believe in the vaccines. And when you ask them, where do the information comes from? 60% is saying comes from social media. So I think we have a problem with social media. So if we want to address it, we need to go back to social media and then correct the information at this particular platform, and maybe speaking the language, of those who are of those internautes, who are on those different platforms in this particular sense. So I think in that regard, technology is helping us of getting very, very quickly, to the information which we need, and then putting them in place, solutions to address some of those things. It is amazing how wrong information has a much faster grip in social media than when you want to give them, the right information. I think even if it uses the same channel, it's not as popular, as some of those informations what we are seeing on social media in this particular aspect. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is in terms also in I think through the COVAX facility, UNICEF is the main procurer and distributor of the vaccines. I mean, there are many partners in this particular COVAX facilities. But I think you're also aware, that you have, bad forces out there, who basically are selling their own vaccines, which are maybe, fake vaccines. So you need to track those medications as well, in particular, in low-income countries, where you have quite a number of, fake medicines and fake vaccines as well, because people are trying to make a quick buck out of the miseries of some people. So I think we're using technology as well of trying to track those different items, when they get into the countries and where they're basically utilized. So technology can play a very important role there as well. And then my last point would be really, and I think we might not be discussing this here, but it's something which we really need to address, is waste management. I think waste management with the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular when it comes to PPEs, it's not just personal protective equipment in health facilities, but we are now pushing it out into the communities. I mean, everybody's wearing masks and they're all over the place. If you're not addressing this issue in terms of waste, then we will have another global issues, facing basically of managing, this particular waste, which could be contaminated waste just in the environment in which you need to address. And I think technology can help us basically address this other factors, which is coming definitely with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely. And perhaps to weave together a couple of threads from those conversations and transition us into our final part of the discussion, hearing really important points on the use of social media and particularly misinformation on social media, and thinking through how we amplify credible information. Dr. Varley, your comments on organizations that haven't traditionally been engaged in healthcare suddenly needing to manage health data and work to promote messages around health behavior. And then Dr. Kampo, even your points on waste, these are all challenges where I think we can agree that there is technology that can be useful, but is often moving faster than policy. And so I think that this is as we transition to this final part of our discussion, we know that these technologies do typically tend to move faster than public policy or policy within companies, and this can create inherent tension. And I'd love to, as our final part of our discussion today, hear a little bit more from you all about how you're working with policymakers to address some of these challenges and where you would like to see greater political leadership. And for Dr. Nabi, perhaps I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit more about your behavioral economic work.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I completely agree with the points that were made earlier on. And I do think that, especially with regard to COVID vaccine delivery, technology is going to play an important role. And we have to, given the scale of the problem. So there are a lot of technological solutions. There is a vaccine credential initiative with Microsoft and Mayo Clinic. They've developed that, where the primary aim is to enable individuals to access a trustworthy and verifiable copy of their vaccination records in digital form. There's also vaccine passports, which can lead to a lot of other issues as well down the line. But I do think digital solutions will be key moving forward. They do have their own limitations, and they could increase some of the inequities that we were discussing early on, because a digitized system based on proof of immunization will amplify the lack of access. And we have to be careful before we implement these things, or be thoughtful when we do eventually implement them. With regard to my own work, I recently joined a working group at the World Health Organization on digital strategy for the next 5 years. And a big focus of mine would be to understand how to promote equity in distribution of resources as well as technologies. And how do we bring that element? Because I do think for the last several decades, the conversation has been the conversation has been on the side of people with resources, which is unfortunate, because I think it should be a partnership when it comes to global issues. So I'm trying to move the needle on that topic and try to make some changes in that aspect. And at the same time, I do think, and I would like to hear more from the panel if we have time, on how do we address the inequities that will inevitably develop when we implement some of these solutions. Because COVID has already revealed that it is going to be much more deadly for certain populations. And it's not that the virus is more lethal for certain individuals. It's that certain individuals have been living under a system for so long that has not cared about them, that is so deficient, that the virus just reveals the problems that they have been facing for so long. We have these examples in the US, but we can definitely see examples in a lot of countries in the global South, how vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, they were the ones suffering. And not just from a physiological or clinical point of view, but also from economics point of view. It's very easy for someone like me to sit at home and work remotely and be oblivious to the world around me, but that's not a luxury that a lot of people have, even in the US or other countries that have a lot of resources. So I do feel that we have to pay special attention to these issues. I think we haven't focused on them for so long, and now we're just suffering the consequences of that neglect. So that would be my priority moving forward with the WHO, and I look forward to collaborating with different members on the panel and different people who are speaking to gain more solutions with that regard.
And as we are coming up on time, perhaps I will ask each of our panelists to incorporate this question into their closing remarks. So Kiran, over to you.
Sure, Rebecca. And I mean, I have to say, I really love that Junaid mentioned the inequities. Like right now, I think that so many of these inequities are being totally exposed by COVID. They existed already. Like many of the problems that we have been trying to solve with medication compliance, it's for folks with diabetes, with heart disease. This is rife and rising rapidly across the developing world without all of the resources of the developed world. And the comorbidities that are then happening and the risk of being immunocompromised is just absolutely ballooning. At the same time, it's also exposing, as Junaid mentioned, there's a huge lack of data and inequities in data. Right now, the percentage of sort of people of color, for example, who are involved in stage 3 and stage 4 clinical trials is a minuscule percentage. And all of the evidence suggests, of course, that medications and vaccines do work differently based on folks' genetics background. So in terms of what we're doing directly, it's very clear we're supporting patients using technology to help them with their medication compliance, but also by supporting them, building trust with them so that they will want to provide us with their side effect data that can then, throughout the developing world, if we can do that, we can restore some of the inequities happening on the pharmaceutical side.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Kampo, any last takeaways?
Yes, I think, just to summarize, I think I 100% agree with all the panel members. And I think we need to go back and look at where we are with our systems, and think, the best solutions, to address inequities, is that we really are serious about universal health coverage. Let me put it this way. And if you're really serious about universal health coverage, there's one component which really needs to be in place in every single country, which is basically primary health care. We need to make sure that every person on this planet has actually accessible, to a basic package, whatever the package should be, respective to their countries, to the respective countries, should be basically having access to this primary healthcare package. If this can be done, then we will be addressing the issues of inequities. We will be able to roll out a program such as like the COVID-19 vaccines much faster and also much cheaper in a sense. And my last point, I just want to put in the corrections here, and I think just for Kiran, I think the COVAX facility has taken into account, the indemnity and liability and regulatory authorities, So I'm happy to actually, I need to do justice to most of the AMC countries, because most of the AMC countries do actually have their regulations in place and vaccine can be shipped to those countries.
Absolutely. Dr. Kampo, I'm getting a message that we do need to wrap up. I want to thank our panelists and give my time over to Dr. Varley to share one last remarks as we close out this panel.
Well, first, just so wonderful to be here today and a great discussion. I think one closing thought is, as we think about influencing and advising on policy, we have a position here in a moment where within the healthcare community, we can really move the needle on policy. But I don't know that we always look for perfect. I think we look to optimize because, healthcare is one of many different sort of components of policy development. And so I think there's a really unique balance that will probably vary across each geography based on things like, specific industries that might, live in that country, specific goals that country might have amid, tackling the pandemic. Is your belief that you're looking to eradicate COVID, domestically? Is your belief that you think it's going to be with us for a long time? And depending on what your goals are and, goals around, morbidity and mortality reduction, and goals for restoring, a return to normal for society where, especially small to medium-sized businesses might have been largely impacted. And that has health implications in and of itself. I think just recognizing that we're part of a very large equation here and, being positioned as, individuals with strong evidence-based information in the healthcare mindset, bringing that to the table and forming a really robust conversation around it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for your participation today. Talia, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so very much, Rebecca. Fantastic job moderating. You had a fantastic panel. And again, just